we're going to be diving again into our fourth week on the book of Mark. We're talking about Jesus as the Messiah, and that's the series title that we have, Messiah. Now, when we read the Gospel of Mark, a lot of times what we want to read it as if it's like a journal entry or as if it's like some random stories and teachings of Jesus all put together. But what we've been looking at for the past month is that it's not. Mark actually had a very particular purpose in terms of what he wanted to communicate. There's a specific wording that he uses. There's a specific order, and all of it matters to lead up to his grand purpose, which he explains in chapter 1, verse 1, which is this. The beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. See, Mark is trying to make this claim that Jesus is the Messiah, that the long-awaited one that the Jewish people had been waiting for and longing for would come and restore the kingdom and rebuild the broken city and restore a reconciliation among God and the people had come. He was the long-awaited one. And in our first week, when we were talking about Mark, we talk about the politics of the Messiah. We talk about how every 4 years, we sort of look to a new Messiah to sort of heal our nation and fix the brokenness and address the problems that have happened. But what Mark is trying to point out is like, look, there is only one Messiah who can really ultimately do that. And it's Jesus. He's the only one who can deliver us out of the brokenness that we have. And the reason he can do that is because he's God. He isn't voted into power. He isn't born into power. He doesn't take his kingly role by force. Instead, what Jesus did was he laid down his life in order to become king. And you can't stop a king like that, because when he dies, he comes back to life. When he loses, he wins. And ultimately, he is the only Messiah that can heal and bring redemption to the whole world. And then in our next week, we kind of looked at how he was the Messiah that can overthrow all other rulers and all other dominions and kingdoms that have been set up in this world and in our lives to set up his own kingdom. So we looked at the story of where Jesus sets the demon-possessed man free. That Jesus steps in and he says, listen, I'm going to set up a new kingdom. And he shows that he has the power to do it. It's not just talk, it's real. And the people were amazed, and what we learn is that any rules, any kingdoms, any addiction that we have in our life that possesses us, that holds us captive, any physical or mental illness, that God can overthrow it and set up a new rule, a new kingdom that is under his control and under his dominion. Now, there's some of us immediately that are like, wait a second, I've submitted to Jesus, but I still deal with this mental illness. I still deal with this physical ailment. I still deal with addiction. And there's always going to be a now and not yetness to the kingdom of God. That when we enter into God's kingdom, when we say, you are king and I submit all rule and control to you, that sort of begins this process of restoration. It begins the process of healing. But the total fullness of it will not come until Jesus returns the second time, when Jesus ends all evil, all other kingdoms once and for all, and establishes his rule here on earth. And so we long await that, and until that comes, there's sort of this now, yes, he is king, but I also long for something more, and we look towards Jesus's return. And then last week, we looked at the storm-calming presence of the Messiah, that Mark really shows us that the Messiah, that Jesus was so powerful that he could not just heal. He didn't just bring people back to life, but he controlled all creation. He was able to calm the winds and the water instantaneously. What we also looked at is how the disciples didn't feel like Jesus was really caring for them, because if he really was in control, why would he put them through the storm? Why would they have to go through this experience of the turbulent waters and wind? Why would they have to be so afraid? And sometimes the thing that is hardest for us to grasp and is most scary for us is that we can't control the storm, but we also can't control Jesus. And so in that, we have to trust that even what is happening around us, even in the midst of what's happening around us, Jesus still loves us. That even when it seems like he's asleep and he's not doing anything, that his love for us is so great and it's so much bigger than the power of any storm. And so we can rest that he is with us through all of that. Now, today, we're approaching Thanksgiving, and we're actually going to talk about the Thanksgiving of the Messiah. Now, I don't know about you guys, but for me, I don't really feel like Thanksgiving is next week. Like, it's this weird thing of I feel like it's already been a forever long winter, but it's also still September. And so I don't know that anybody else feels that way, but I'm really not prepared and not ready for Thanksgiving. I don't feel like it's coming. And on top of that, just this past week, I realized that we skipped one of my most favorite family traditions that we do to get ready for Thanksgiving. See, about 10 years ago, Zach was pulling this dead bush out of our backyard. And it really was a dead bush. Like it was dead. And I, for some reason, was like, this bush symbolizes Thanksgiving. And so I took this dead bush that he had pulled out and I took like a big chunk of it and I stuck it in a glass vase and filled it with rocks and I named it our Thanksgiving tree. And thus the tradition for our family began that every Thanksgiving, this dead bush lives in our living room. And every Thanksgiving, me and the girls, or at the beginning of November, we cut out these leaves and we have a stack of leaves next to the dead bush that was pulled out of our yard. And every night at dinner, everyone takes a leaf and we write one thing that we're thankful for and we sort of dress the Thanksgiving tree. And by the end, it has all these things that we're thankful for and sort of prepares our heart and our spaces for Thanksgiving. Now, I realized this past week that it was like 1 week to Thanksgiving and we have done that. We haven't cut the leaves. In fact, I looked at it and I realized there were leaves on it. I never took the leaves off from last year. Like normally I put them away with Christmas decorations, but the ones from 2019 are still on the tree and I've done nothing to be thankful for 2020. I just missed it. It was like in the middle of virtual school and broken bones and like pandemic fatigue and like all of the things. I completely let go and skipped this really important tradition for our family. Like I just missed it. And as I was thinking about it this past week, I realized like my immediate like thought and connection was like, well, there's really not that much to be thankful for anyways. Like what would we even put on a Thanksgiving tree? Like, thank you for a pandemic. Thank you for my rapid COVID test that it came back in an hour, right? Like what do we be thankful for? It sort of feels like in comparison to all of the economic depression and the job loss and people getting ill and the mental fatigue and illness rising as fast as the economic situation declines and our physical situation declines. Like, it just feels like, what are we supposed to be thankful for? I just feel totally exhausted that all the good things just seem so small in comparison to the mess that we stand in the middle of. Now, what's ironic is this week, as a part of our interactive reading group on the book of Mark, I was reading through chapter 8 of Mark, and I was reminded that I think the crowds that Jesus spoke to might have felt the exact same way of like, what are you giving thanks for? It's not really that important. And so I went back and I looked at Mark 6, is where the story kind of starts. And what we're told is that there was this large crowd that had gathered, and it says that Jesus had compassion on the large crowd, and so he began to teach this large crowd, and it says that then after it had been a long time, like he had been teaching for a really, really long time, the disciples came to Jesus, and he said, this is a remote place. And it's already really late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy something to eat. But Jesus answered, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, that would take more than half a year's wages. Are we just supposed to go and spend that much money on bread and give it to them to eat? How many loaves do you think that we have? And Jesus goes, go and see. And then they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. And then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. And so they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and he broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among all of them. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up the 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The numbers of the men who had eaten was 5,000. Now, I just think about that whole thing of Jesus sort of saying, no, you give them something to eat, like turning to the disciples, no, you feed them. And the disciples having that sheer panic of, are you kidding? Like, I can't do that. You know how much money that's gonna cost to feed all of these people? And it wasn't just about the lack of money, right? Even if they had the amount of money that they needed to feed these people, there wasn't like a Costco warehouse that they could just go and buy in bulk and be like, don't worry, we brought the food, feed the people. They didn't have that. Like, in this remote place, there's no chance that they would have had enough food, even if they had the money, to feed all of these people. It was impossible. And so Jesus turns to them and he says, well, find out how many loaves we have. Like, how many loaves are there? Now, the interesting thing about this question, Jesus doesn't ask it because he needs there to be a certain number of loaves. Like, Jesus doesn't need like, oh, there's only 4. I really needed 5. Like, that's not the point of this. Jesus is just like, hey, how many are there? Like, you have to remember that Jesus, we're told in John chapter 1 that Jesus was with God in the beginning at creation, which means Jesus was a part of God. He was the creator. He was a part of the creator who gave birth to this whole world, who created everything out of nothing. He is the God who, when the Israelite people were wandering around in the desert and had nothing to eat, created manna, this bread that was like these flakes that appeared like dew on the ground. He made manna appear out of nothing. And so it wasn't that he just needed 5 loaves. Like, it wasn't like, well, what's the bare minimum here? He's just asking, hey, what is it that we have? And one of the things that I think is important is that while the disciples are like, hey, we don't have enough, they're coming from this scarcity mindset of like, there's not enough. Jesus is saying, yeah, but what do we have? Like, what does it look like for us to have this abundance mindset and say, well, what do we have? Well, we have 5 loaves and 2 fish. The important part of this question is to hold that 5 loaves and 2 fish in comparison to the 5,000. And it says there were 5,000 men, but in those days, they didn't count the women and children. If you counted the women and children, it probably would have been more like 20,000 people. So 5 loaves, 2 fish for 20,000 people. The equivalent of this would be me standing in this room right now and having 3 breadcrumbs and saying, I'm going to feed the people abundantly, right? It sounds ridiculous. And yet Jesus takes this breadcrumb amount of food and he says, I give thanks. Thank you, Father, for what you have given. Now, to the people in the crowds, this must have been this ridiculous thing. Like, he's giving thanks for breadcrumbs? Like, how is this supposed to work? That's completely foolish. That's absolutely ridiculous. There is nothing there. But somehow between the beginning and the end of Jesus giving thanks, these foolish breadcrumbs multiply into an abundance that not only feed the 20,000, but that there are baskets left over. This thanksgiving for this small amount become this massive miracle. Now, the fascinating thing is that 2 chapters later, in Mark chapter 8, there's like an identical story that happens. Like, it's almost exactly the same. If you compare them, there's so many similarities. Like listen to this. Chapter 8, verse 1. During those days, another large crowd. Now, sometimes people are like, oh, it's just a repeat. He made a mistake. Like, the scribes who were copying it, they just went back. No. Mark's making a point. Another large crowd gathered. It's not the same large crowd. Another large crowd gathered. And since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. Same thing he felt before. They have already been with me 3 days and they have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they'll collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance. And his disciples answered, but where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? Now, I used to read this response of the disciples sort of like, they don't get it, like they missed it again. They're panicking yet again. Oh no, where are we going to get the food to feed him? But I wish I was there. Like I wish I could have heard it, because maybe they weren't panicked at all. Like maybe they were baiting Jesus. Oh no, what are we going to do? It's a large crowd and you have compassion on them and have been teaching them for too long. It's a very remote place. We will never find enough bread to feed all these people. What are you going to do? What are you going to do, right? Like, I just wonder, how is it that they said that? What? Were they panicked? Or were they awaiting something? Were they like, no, we know how this one goes. We know what happens. And right on cue, Jesus turns to them and he says, hey, how many loaves do you have? 7, they replied. It's a different number this time. 7, they replied. And he told the crowd to sit down on the ground. Same thing. And when he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, same thing, he broke them and gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well, and he gave thanks for them also, and he told the disciples to distribute them. And the people ate and were satisfied. Now afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 were present. And again, there may have been more if they were just counting the men or they were counting the women or children. Now this thing is so similar, like the story is so similar. Like, why would Mark include it? There's a lot of scholars that say that there's, you can find it in the very few differences that are there. Like, for example, the fact that there were 12 basketfuls left over represents the 12 tribes of Israel, and the 7 basketfuls that were left over in the second one represents the 7 tribes that were in the promised land that had to be kicked out. And based on the locations of where these things happened, in the first one, it was a group of Jewish people. In the second one, it was a group of Gentiles. Now, that doesn't mean a lot to you and me, but the significance of that in the biblical narrative is that the first miracle happens to the people who God had made a covenant with, the promised people. God had said, listen, I'm going to take care of these people. Like, these are my people. So I'm going to provide for them. They're hungry. I'm going to feed them. But then the craziest thing happens when, in a totally different context, Jesus is out with a whole bunch of Gentiles, like the have-nots, the people who were not originally a part of the covenant, the people who were sort of the outcasts of the Jewish people, the people who were the unclean. And Jesus says, no, for these people, they're hungry, and I'm going to feed them too. And so essentially the difference between these two stories is Jesus is saying, listen, I haven't just come to feed my people. I've come to feed the world. I've come to feed all of them. And in both of these, it's sort of wrapped around this thing of breadcrumb amount. Jesus gives thanks, and there is a miracle of overabundance. But I also think that there's something about the wording that is super important. Remember, Mark did all of this on purpose. There's this repeated phrase in these two stories that then Jesus took the bread, he gave thanks for this foolish amount, he broke it, and then he gave it to the disciples. It's like these are the words that we cue into. And as you continue to read the book of Mark, you see this phrase come up again in Mark chapter 14. It's when Jesus is gathered at the table with his disciples on the last night before he dies. The last night before Jesus lays down his life. And we're told this happens. That while they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take it, this is my body." And then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many," he said to them. You see the pattern. There's this pattern. This time, Jesus isn't holding out and giving thanks for breadcrumbs. This time, Jesus is taking bread and he's saying, "This is my body that's been broken. This is my body that in a little bit will be beaten and marred beyond recognition. And I'm going to give thanks for it. And then this is the cup. This cup represents my blood that has been spilled out for all the brokenness of the whole world. And I give thanks for it. The first time Jesus gives thanks for breadcrumbs to show that he feeds his own people. The second time he gives thanks for breadcrumbs to show that he feeds the world. And this third time he gives thanks not for breadcrumbs, but for pain and suffering. He's about ready to face the abandonment of God, and he gives thanks for the very thing that will break him, for the very thing that will crush him, for the very thing that will wound him. Who does that? Who does that? Thanksgiving is really supposed to be something that you do for like something nice, something good, a gift that you've received that you really like, a comfort. We give thanks for those sort of things. We don't give thanks for breadcrumbs. We don't give thanks for broken bodies. We don't give thanks for poured out blood. And yet, Jesus took the bread, he gave thanks, he broke it, and gave it to the disciples. This phrase almost like becomes this Pavlovian like phrase for the disciples, right? Like, you know, Pavlov's law, he like dings the bell and the dogs start salivating, and he dings the bell, feeds the dog a treat, and the dogs salivate. And he does it so much that the dogs associate that the bell means a treat. The bell means a treat, right? It's like Jesus says these phrases. He took the bread, he gave thanks, he broke it, he gave to the disciples, and the disciples are thinking to themselves, he gave thanks for something foolish. A miracle is about to happen. Like their ears perk up, their eyes dart side to sides, their butts move to the edge of the seat, and their minds begin to think, where is the miracle? He's giving thanks for something so foolish. Where's the miracle? Where's it going to be? What's it going to be? They're salivating for a miracle. And that night, what happens doesn't look anything like a miracle. That night, what happens is that Jesus is arrested. And the next day, Jesus is crucified, that his body is definitely broken, his blood is poured out. But the miraculous part of it, the miraculous thing that happens, is that the world is fed. That those who hungered for reconciliation received it. Those who starved for love were fed. Those who craved for belonging. Those who were malnourished for forgiveness. Those who needed life, they were all fed. And Jesus gives thanks, and a miracle happens. The miracle of the joy of enduring the cross to bring freedom. The joy of the abundant life and hope and resurrection and transformation. See, the word in each of these chapters, in chapter 6 and chapter 8 and chapter 14, the Greek word that's used is Christos. Thank you, Eucharisteo. Thanks, that's my husband. He knows Greek with me. Not really, but he backs me up. Christia, say it again. Eucharisteo. The word is Eucharisteo. It's the word that we get the word Eucharist, the fancy word that we call communion. And in the middle of this word is the word chara. It's the Greek word for joy. See, sometimes the height of our joy can come only when we dig to the depths of our thanksgiving. The more gratitude that we're able to express, the more joy we are able to experience. When we give thanks for the breadcrumbs, our hearts are paved for joy and for a miracle. Yesterday, we did our distribution project for the Holiday Giving Project. Some of you have heard me talk about this, that the county sort of bands together with all sorts of nonprofits and religious organizations and individuals and all sorts of different things to try to provide and meet the needs of those in the community who are most vulnerable. And they provide food at Thanksgiving, and then they help with food and gifts at Christmas. And we're actually a part of both of those projects. You'll hear a little bit later of how we're going to partner with them for Christmas, but yesterday was the distribution for Thanksgiving. And if you are a faithful giver here, you were a part of that because you helped create the resources available in order to give to those people. There were even people in our community who gave as well. And so we came and cars lined up. The people who were registered for this project came, and we were able to give them some resources in order to help make Thanksgiving a little bit better. Now, the thing that was fascinating is as we were doing this, the gratitude that came from these cars, like the gratitude that spilled forth from the people who were there was amazing. Like, thank you so much. Thank you for doing this. There was one woman who just teared up as we handed her the resources, and she was so incredibly grateful. And we don't get to know the people's stories. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking maybe you lost your job. Like maybe you're swimming in a debt of medical debt because of some sort of family illness. Maybe you don't know where your next groceries will come from. Maybe this is all you have to sustain yourself for the week. Like maybe things are really horrible for you. And yet, when most people took the things that we had to give, it was met with such thanksgiving. And I kept thinking, this is a bag of groceries and a gift card. This is breadcrumbs in comparison to what it is that you ultimately need. But the gratitude welled up, and their hearts were filled with joy. Because in the middle of Thanksgiving comes joy. But I want to be clear that what we're talking about is not just hey, if you would just look on the bright side of life, then things would be brighter. That's not what we're talking about. We're not saying hey, if you just be thankful to the universe will be good to you. That's not what we're talking about either. I'm not saying, hey, we just all need our perspective shift. What I'm saying is that what is rooted in thanksgiving is our ability to surrender and trust that God can take the breadcrumbs, that God can take the pain and transform it into love and goodness and beauty. I think about this when I think about a caterpillar. When I was in elementary school, I learned that word metamorphosis, that the caterpillar metamorphosizes into a butterfly. And I had this mental picture in my mind that the way that this happened was that caterpillar somehow spun himself into a cocoon or a chrysalis and then built all the things, and then his little all these little legs somehow joined together and formed a wing, and somehow his very small tongue stretched out and formed a big tongue into a proboscis, and somehow his eyeballs shifted, and that's how that metamorphosis happened, that it was just sort of things shifting. But what metamorphosis really means is that it changes at the core of something, that the essence of something changes. And what actually happens is that caterpillar turns into goo. There is nothing recognizable about that caterpillar when it is inside that chrysalis. Goo. And that goo reorders itself at the core and essence of its being. And in the time frame of 5 to 21 days, becomes a butterfly. Guys, that's what we're talking about when we talk about the transformation of God. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about what God does. And so right now, as we approach Thanksgiving, if you feel like you are a pile of goo, if you feel like all you can do is put the covers over you and just melt into a pile of goo, that's okay. If all you can be thankful for is the blanket that covers you, if all you can be thankful for is the God who somehow, even though you can't see it, is still in control and still loves you, That's okay. Because we serve a God who takes breadcrumbs and feeds multitudes. We serve a God who takes pain and suffering and turns it into life abundant. We serve a God who is in the business of metamorphosis. And it begins with an invitation to the Eucharist table. It begins with this invitation to meet with Jesus at the table and to give thanks for what he has done. See, for those who follow Christ, Thanksgiving isn't a nationalistic holiday. For those who follow Christ, it's something that we do every time we gather to the table. And we remember what Jesus has done for us, that his body was broken and his blood was poured out. And we give thanks for it. And then we salivate for a miracle, for an abundant life. And so this is my invitation for you this morning. We're going to take communion together. And it doesn't matter whether you're here in this room or you're in your living room or you're in your kitchen or you're on a walk, or wherever it is you are. This is our invitation to meet with a God who takes the breadcrumbs and suffering of our life and transforms them into a miracle. And so as we meet with God in these moments, I'm inviting you to give thanks for whatever it is that you have and to salivate for a miracle. So I invite you to grab whatever you have to represent the bread and take it. And in this moment, I invite for you to just recognize what this actually represents. This represents Jesus' broken body, the pain and the suffering. And for a moment, I ask that you would imbue in this piece of bread all of the pain and suffering that you also may be experiencing. And to just recognize that God can take that and he can transform it into a miracle. So on the night before Jesus died, he gathered his disciples around. And he took the bread and he broke it. He gave thanks for it and he gave it to his disciples, saying, "This is my body that has been broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And then he took the cup. And he said, "This is my blood that has been spilled out for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Father God, would you meet us at this table? Would you meet us in this place of brokenness, in this place of pain, in this place of feeling like all I have are some breadcrumbs? Would you meet us in this place of disappointment and fatigue? Would we surrender, trust, and control to you, knowing that we give thanks not because what we have in this moment is what we need or is what we want, but because we know that you are a God of metamorphosis, that you are a God who gives the things we give to you and transforms them into things that are good and things that are beautiful. So, Father, would thanksgiving well up in our hearts? Would thanksgiving pave the road for joy? Would thanksgiving pave the road for a miracle? Father God, we look for you. We salivate for you. We long for you to feed us. Father, meet us at this table. Amen.